Welcome to lecture set 36, where we will do a brief overview of the different biomes and ecosystems that are found on Earth. So your standards for this lecture set are 1C.3, which deals with the photosynthesis in the upper layers of aquatic life zones and how that supports life throughout the rest of the ecosystem. And 2A.2, that is talking about areas of similar climate across the world, are known as biomes. There are 7 terrestrial biomes and 3 aquatic ones. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to do the following things. So you're describing the layers of a lake in terms of location and temperature, describing the layers of the ocean in terms of location and relation to solar penetration, defining biomes, identifying common climate, precipitation, animals, and plants in terrestrial biomes, being able to identify biomes on a map based on most likely temperature and precipitation, compare and contrast freshwater, brackish, and saltwater life zones, identify the kind of organisms that would live in aquatic life zones, and explain how brackish ecosystems have higher biodiversity than other areas. So first of all, let's talk about what biomes and life zones actually are. So the world around us is our biosphere. So it's an area of many different systems and organisms living and contributing to a cycle of nutrients, energy, and matter. So we're talking about the interaction between the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the ecosphere, giving us all this biosphere. So when all of these things work together, they provide habitats for organisms. And all of the different habitats for a living organism that work together in the same area are connected together, and they are called ecosystems. So ecosystems have many different kinds of organisms living in the same place, and they are made up of biotic and abiotic components and interactions. Remember, biotic means living, abiotic means non-living. So within our ecosystem, we have populations or groups of the same organism living in the same place at the same time. We have communities, which are many different populations living together at the same place at the same time. So those are our basic components of an ecosystem. So when we talk about biomes and life zones, we have to separate them out because biomes are terrestrial designations, life zones are aquatic designations. So with a biome, we're going to look specifically for shared climate, precipitation, and organisms. And we're typically going to break those into about 7 categories. In a life zone, we're looking for shared characteristics such as the organisms that live there and the salinity of the water. And those are typically broken into 3 categories: the marine, the fresh, and the estuary, which is the brackish water. So when we talk about the biomes and life zones that exist, we're looking here at the 7 to 8 major ones. Okay, so what we have are, you'll see here on the map, we're going to start at the upper latitudes and work our way toward the equator. So tundra is found at the highest altitudes, the highest latitudes. And those are going to be the ones that are kind of permanently frozen, okay? So they have very little precipitation. They're very cold. The plants that grow there are very short, and they are under a permanent layer of what is called permafrost. So that area is completely frozen. It stays that way, and it never changes. You'll notice here, especially in Greenland, you see this white part here that's designated as a desert. In this case, we're looking at, it would be called a cold desert. And that cold desert is typically going to be tundra with very, very little precipitation. So from the tundra, we move downward, and the next thing that we're going to see is the boreal forest, or the taiga. This is an area made up of largely coniferous trees, and it's found at high altitudes and along the edge of a tundra. So they receive a little bit more precipitation than a tundra. They're a little bit warmer. If we move a little further south, we're going to see the temperate deciduous forest. That is the ecosystem and the biome of North Carolina. Temperate deciduous forests tend to be found in the mid-latitude areas, and they support trees such as maple, oak, and ash that tend to drop their leaves in the autumn and the wintertime. Temperate deciduous forests have distinct seasons, rich soil, and moderate rainfall. So the next thing that we have is grasslands and savannas. They have many characteristics in common, but there are several key ones. So we're going to start with grasslands first. So grasslands are areas of hardy grasses that typically receive moderate rainfall and a typical um, warm climate. It may be warmer than coastal areas. It may be colder than coastal areas, depending on the location of that grassland. The other characteristic that's very similar to that is a savanna. Savannas tend to be found, number one, closer to the equator, typically around the edges of deserts. Savannas can support trees. They're very small trees, but savannas can support them. Grasslands cannot do that. Moving further south, we're going to end up in a desert. Deserts are often called the hot desert. That's what we typically think of when we think of desert. They have very little vegetation, and the vegetation that they have is very especially adapted. Very little rainfall, and an extreme climate. So during the day, temperatures can peak in the hundreds, and by nightfall, it can drop to below zero. Deserts tend to be heavily concentrated in that 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south latitude, as well as the central part of Australia. Next, we have what's called the chaparral. The chaparral is an area that's a transition period between a desert and another biome. They're common along coastal areas, especially in the Mediterranean. So if you look here, Italy, Greece, Turkey, those areas are really common with this chaparral kind of biome. So you have short shrubs, thorny bushes. You get a moderate amount of rainfall because typically you're near a coast. It's very warm. And those areas are commonly also found on the leeward side of mountains, especially when you're trying to get that transition from one biome to another. Lastly, we have the tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforests are typically concentrated along the equator. They have very high numbers of unique organisms and trees, even though the soil itself isn't very nutrient rich. Additionally, a typical tropical rainforest has very high precipitation, very high and hot climate. So the other thing we need to talk about are life zones. So aquatic life zones are broken up based on their geographic structure and their salt content. So we have marine, fresh, and estuary, which is the brackish, the mix of fresh and saltwater. So when you look at the parts of a marine life zone, which is shown here, there are a couple basic pieces that you need to know. Number one, you need to know the intertidal zone, which is the region between high tide and low tide. You need to know the oceanic zone, which is also called the pelagic. So from the edge of the coast all the way out into the open ocean is called the pelagic zone. When you go down in the water, the very top is called the photic zone. That is where light can penetrate through. Photosynthesis is really active and really common. If you go further down, everything else is what we call the aphotic zone. Light cannot penetrate down that far. So we have it separated based on light penetration. It's also divided into different pieces just because of the kinds of organisms that you might find there. So the very top is called the epipelagic. Epipelagic. The epipelagic. And that tends to coincide with that photic zone. This is where you're going to have a lot of those small photosynthetic organisms, jellyfish, things that kind of float at the top. The second layer that you have is called the bathypelagic zone. It's the middle portion. That's where your larger organisms are going to live. That's where your whales, sharks, those kinds of organisms are going to live. The very bottom, you have the abyssal pelagic, and that is the very bottom. That's where you're going to find these kind of benthic organisms like the anglerfish, things that live on dead matter. So that's the marine ecosystem. That's the marine life zone. The freshwater life zone really depends on whether you're talking about a river or you're talking about a lake. We have already talked about the parts of a river. So if you're not comfortable with those, go back to the water use lecture set and make sure that you understand that. For a freshwater life zone, what you have is basically three parts. So the coastal area here that's on the edge of the lake is called the littoral zone. Littoral. The littoral zone is the area that provides an anchor for plants, supports a lot of life. That's really where you're also going to see that estuary area start to come in, especially if you're very near, if this is a lake that's near a coast. So you have the littoral zone, which is the edge. The main part of the lake is called the limnetic zone. And then underneath that, you have the profundal zone, which is everything to the bottom. In the summer and winter, there's a very clear temperature differential in a lake. The top is very warm, the bottom is very cold. So it stratifies. In the spring and the fall, what happens is that cold water that's very nutrient rich kind of starts churning. And you get this kind of upwelling process that happens, and it forms what's called overturn. And lake overturn happens in the spring and the fall, and it helps to distribute nutrients throughout the water. The last aquatic life zone that you have is the estuary. So the estuary is this kind of catch-all term for any location where freshwater and marine life zones meet. And we call these ecotones, Ecotones. These are areas in which ecosystems overlap and create a new, unique ecosystem. And estuaries, as ecotones, tend to have organisms that aren't found anywhere else, and they really encourage the development of biodiversity. Unfortunately, the ecotone, the estuary, the wetlands, typically those are some of the first areas that are damaged and removed because of human actions. Take a look at your objectives, make sure that you understand all those, and let me know if you have questions.